Welcome back to the Donkey Vote podcast with Francis.
Tobias.
And George. These interviews will be focusing on the past careers of politicians before they entered parliament.
With a strong intention to our audience that anything is achievable no matter what you studied in university or college.
If you like this sort of content, please make sure you like, subscribe, comment, and share with your friends. Also, we are on YouTube and Spotify, so make sure you follow us on those platforms.
Make sure to follow us on Instagram as well to keep updated with the latest episodes and reels that we release.
Enjoy
the
the
interview.
Today we are joined by our second actual member from the UK, Luke Taylor. Luke, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. I'm curious to find out who your first one was. Other than like a Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer, and you're suddenly now coming down to the more minor politicians. I hope that won't be reflected badly upon.
I mean, I like to rate him as someone, who's of that caliber, but I don't know if you know who it is. It was Desmond Swain. So
Desmond, very quite a character.
he is quite a character.
He is a character.
I think you probably experienced some of his
well,
characteristics in Parliament.
good story. One of my first interactions in Parliament was turning up on the I think it was the Monday after the election on the Thursday, and I was walking through the grounds right at the very foot of Big Ben, where you walk from Portcullis House, which is where all the MPs' offices are, and the House of Parliament. And I'm walking along, and there's this fella in front of me in torn jeans and a baggy t-shirt and scruffy trainers, and I'm there in my suit because we're all put upon us that you need to be smart and you need to be quite formal around Parliament. I'm like, God, who's this guy? And obviously Parliament's not sitting at this point. It's still, everybody's getting their new offices and things. And as I walk past him, I kind of look past, and it's Desmond Swain. And he's just come off the tube with a plastic bag with his sandwiches and a coffee cup in. And he's, clearly been there for years and years and years. And the place is his kind of domain. And he's just, slobbing it out and enjoying his summer, I think, is the best. So that's my link to Desmond Swain. There you go.
Did you speak to Desmond while you were walking to Parliament?
I didn't as I walked past him, but I have passed him in the corridors a couple of times, and he's always very beaming smile. And I think once you've been there for the years that he has, you tend to feel quite comfortable and quite confident about wandering around and seeing all these new fresher MPs, slightly confused and startled at seeing people like him in the corridors.
And it's quite interesting as well that the 2024 UK election just happened, and there's been a lot of new MPs, a lot of turnover, especially on the Conservative side of politics, with massive wipeout for them. And you're starting to see a lot of new MPs entering the building. I don't know exactly the number, but I'm going to assume it's probably upwards of like 200 new MPs.
So I think of the 650 MPs that were elected, I think it was 318.
Oh wow!
So it's almost half. Yeah, were new MPs, and I think that was a combination both of the loss of Conservative MPs, so people losing their seat anyway, but also a lot of longer standing MPs stood down, because I think the last 9 years have been, there's been 90 years worth of politics happen in the last 9 years, with Brexit, with the pandemic, with wars in Europe, with crisis in the Middle East. So there's a lot has happened, and there's been a lot of responsibility on politicians to come up with responses to that. And I think quite fairly, a lot of them said, look, I've done my time. This has been incredibly turbulent, and actually now I will turn to either go back to spend more time with my family or get involved in consultancy or advocacy or lobbying, or that sort of stuff. So I just think this was quite a big moment where obviously Labour landslide, but also a lot of politicians kind of personally said, look, that's enough for me. I'm out.
I mean, which is totally fair, as you said. The whole COVID time was quite a jubilous and crazy time. I'm speaking from the Australian perspective. I'm guessing the UK was, probably might have been even worse in sense of, how that time was, because, we're still dealing with Brexit at the time. Yeah. And then straight after you leave the European Union, you get straight into a pandemic. So that must have been a very, very interesting time in British politics.
it was. It couldn't have happened at a much worse time. And not only did you have COVID, you had Donald Trump being elected in the US, so you had a lot of political earthquakes occurring as well, right at the beginning of well, during that period. So you had the tail end of the Donald Trump. You had then turbulence over the transition, and again political turbulence in the UK. So it was quite a period, and I'm kind of glad that that is all past now, and that we are able to look forward to try and kind of a little bit more of normality. I think a lot of politicians are quite grateful for that.
And hopefully now, especially even with the Labour majority, even though I'm guessing from your perspective, it probably wouldn't be, I would say the best thing, you'd love to be in government or,
Yeah,
as
absolutely.
a kingmaker for sure. At least there'll be some stability now for the foreseeable future, at least for the next 4 or 5 years, with Labour having at least, I think, nearly over 100 seat majority. Um,
Yeah, it is. It's the Labour effectively able to govern as they see fit, and whilst that brings stability, from my perspective as an opposition politician, we would like to see more of our manifesto implemented, and that becomes a challenge for us to take the advantages that we can from the system, the parliamentary system here, where you do have opposition day debates, you do have the ability to put bills and motions forward, you get to amend legislation as it comes through Parliament, and you try and get as much of your, well, ultimately policies implemented in that way as you possibly can, and you try and align those those things where you would believe the government, who controls things ultimately, things don't get through if they don't want it. You try and find something that they would tolerate, but they don't necessarily want to commit time to. And then you use your time to advocate for those issues. And actually, next week, there's the private members bill ballot happening, which is where individual MPs get the opportunity to submit legislation. As the government does, they control the legislative agenda, but there is this process, and I don't know whether there are equivalents for you in Australia, but you have the opportunity as an individual to put forward bills that you feel are important to you, and you can choose something that is very, very personal, very, very local. You may well have a family member or a constituent who has a particular a priority or a medical problem that needs to have more support or research put into, or you can look at bigger things. Like one of the big ones that is being lobbied for at the moment is the Climate and Nature Bill, which is a real big piece of legislation that will put a lot more focus on responding to climate emergency, but also biodiversity, protecting nature, and all that sort of stuff. And a lot of the stuff in there is stuff that the government would agree with. And so hopefully there'd be a good chance of pushing forward some of the policies in there, and getting the government to agree that it's something that they wouldn't oppose, and therefore you've got more chance of getting that through. So that then comes down, if you're lucky in the private members ballot as an MP, you then get a choice of what you use that opportunity to push for. So hopefully I've got the challenge next week to sit down and be even more bombarded by emails telling me that this is the absolutely most important thing you could possibly do. And then, my first few months in Parliament become much more complicated and much more have a much greater responsibility on me.
It's quite interesting that you said that there's actually a ballot. So they actually handpick the MP who can raise
Yeah,
the bill.
it's exactly. And unfortunately, it's not, trial by combat or, throw in a rock as far as you can, something kind of archaic and typically British like that. It's well, actually, it's not far off. All the names, you choose a number. You literally walk up to a big piece of paper, I think, and put your name next to a number. And then I think, and I forgive everyone if I'm making this up, but I think the process is they put those numbers into balls, and they put the balls in a big bucket, and then there's a ceremonial taking out of balls, like choosing the ties in the FA Cup, choosing the numbers that then get, and I think it's 20 MPs get the names brought out, and then you're in a priority order of how you then have your chance to enact these bills. So it's quite an exciting process, and it is entirely down to luck.
And I know in Australia we don't have that sort of system at all. I think it's really about, I think certain, the government will bring up bills and legislation, the opposition will do the same, and so does the crossbench. I know we don't have a similar party to the Liberal Democrats in Australia at all. We have of course, we have the Greens, Labor and Liberal. The Liberals are really the Conservatives, but we
Yep.
don't really have a similar party to the Liberal Democrats. But yeah, all parties across the political spectrum can bring up a bill whenever you know time sees fit. And a
Yep.
lot of the time as well, when government brings through legislation, the opposition and the crossbench will get briefed on it in party meetings and that sort of thing. So they'll have an idea of what's coming up. But it's not as archaic and as random as you pointed out there with the British system, with
Yeah.
picking balls out of a box,
Yeah. Yeah.
basically.
Yeah. Yeah. It's all a bit odd, but
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it next week, and I've got my
Mm.
my fingers crossed that I'm lucky in the ballot.
Yeah. So I think we'll move on straight into our questions for you, Luke. So
Yeah, of
my
course.
first question to you is, how was your high school and university life? And do you have any memorable moments you'd like to share on the podcast?
Yeah, of course. So I think my schooling uh, impacted my politics quite a lot. So grew up in rural Lincolnshire, which is in kind of the North Midlands. I went to the local comprehensive school, which is just the state school. Both my parents were teachers. My dad taught in a secondary modern school, which is where if you take a selective test for high school at 11, but you fail that test under some of the systems we have in the UK at the moment, you then would go to basically the selective second tier, which is a secondary modern school. So my dad taught kids who'd been told at 11 that they were not going to be academic, and that they were kind of guided towards more practical and non-academic subjects. So he had a real passion for providing opportunity for those kids, inspiring them, making sure that they were able to make the best of that those opportunities that were still there. That selective system means that you have this streaming in a lot of places where the smart kids, and I say the smart kids, but it's also kids who've been able to afford tutoring. They come from families that have the advantages that not everybody has. And at 11, you sit this test, and then your future is fairly set in a lot of cases. So if you pass, you go to a grammar school. If you fail that test, you go to this secondary model where my dad taught. Where my school was slightly different. It was a comprehensive, so it accepted everybody. But from my primary school, a number of my classmates went off to local grammar schools, which are the selective ones. So my mum taught at my school. My dad taught at this kind of the secondary modern school. So very early on, I was very much aware that there was this divergence of opportunity for me, my friends, and the kids that I heard stories about from both my parents around the dinner table in the evenings, and the kids who were struggling, the kids who didn't have any books at home, the kids who would come to school and teachers would arrange, clothes for them, and all the cliches we hear these days about teachers bringing in food and clothing and looking after kids. And I think that kind of started my awareness that there was a lot of unfairness. And my dad was also a local councillor. So I think that's also my journey into politics as well, in that seeing the benefits and what you can do as a counsellor to help people out. So not only would be helping kids in the classroom in his role as a teacher, he would also then be helping them with casework, helping get them onto the housing register, getting benefits where they're available, and generally supporting them outside of school. So this was a real early push for me to become more politically minded, but also see the benefits and the ability to shape people's lives in a positive way through politics. So that was my kind of secondary school. I was deputy head of school in my sixth form, and one of the funny coincidences here is that this was a really bog standard secondary school in the countryside. Nothing special at all. But of the three deputy heads of school that there were, myself and two others one of the others, a fellow called Robbie Moore, is also an MP and was elected 5 years ago as a Conservative. And so from this very small school in my year, there are now two MPs elected and sitting in Parliament. And I think it is coincidence, but it does show that people from a much more modest background, who didn't go to, there's this kind of caricature of a British MP. They go to Eton, they then go to Oxford and Cambridge, and then they become an MP, and they're incredibly rich. And actually, that is changing, and I think that's a good thing. So that was my kind of secondary school, and then university. I came down to London to study at Imperial College. I did Masters of Engineering in Aeronautical Engineering. So if anybody ever tells you that aeronautical engineering, is an easy subject, then I'd fight them. It basically is maths with a little bit of colouring in of aeroplane drawings every now and then. But I was always very interested in aviation, and I loved my degree, and a lot of that then translated into my job when I graduated as an engineering consultant. But at university, I was very involved. I played a lot of rugby. I was president of the sports association in university, and that was kind of my first position of kind of elected responsibility. We're responsible for negotiating between all the sports clubs in the athletics union, ensuring that budgets were allocated fairly, that students were encouraged and able to take part in sport, and I enjoyed that quite a lot. So I think that was one of my first. Well, it was actually my first elected position, and something that I learned a lot from. Kind of, I don't want to say people management, but kind of helping people out, and lots of different perspectives of whether the horse riding society deserved doubling their budget next year, or whether we should be spending more on taekwondo or rugby, where I was enjoying the benefits of the funding that we were able to provide. I graduated almost 18 years ago now.
Oh, wow.
2008. My numbers
16 years ago.
16 years ago. There you go.
Okay. Yes.
But it was I loved university. I was away from my family, and I was able to really kind of take a lot of the opportunity was offered. But again, it highlights that not all of my colleagues, my classmates from my secondary school did go off to university. Lots of them did stay in that rural countryside and get jobs, and make a really great life for themselves in my town. And I see them quite often when I go back to visit my parents. But I was always looking to get out and to look for additional opportunities, and come to London was how I did that.
Interesting. And as you were saying before, I think that's a thing across the whole world. I think a lot of politicians now are coming from, not necessarily the stereotypical politician sort of background. Even I can talk in an Australian perspective. There's a lot of politicians now, coming from parts of Melbourne, parts of Sydney that you'd never think a politician would come from. Some of the most deprived and some of the most multicultural.
And I think that's so important.
It really is
so important, because if you cannot represent a broad range of views and a broad range of life experiences, and I have been relatively lucky. I haven't struggled personally, but I've been in the environments where a lot of my friends, a lot of my colleagues have had various challenges, and I have supported them personally. But now I'm able to, and I guess this is kind of comes on to what my role is as a politician. I'm able to try and implement the changes systemically that will mean you don't end up in those situations in future. And I think as an engineer, I'm a problem solver, and I want to find the best way to fix things. And I think politics is the purest way you can possibly do that. So if you are someone who looks around and sees injustice, if you look around and you see things that are unfair, you can choose to kind of campaign, to be a lobbyist, to push for particular causes or particular actions on poverty, on homelessness, on international affairs like the situation in the Middle East. But actually being in a position as a politician, you have, even if you are an opposition politician, if you're not part of the bigger parties, you have the opportunity to implement real change for people. And that's what attracted me to it. And again, that comes from seeing my dad being able to do that as a councillor.
Yeah, and that's very, very true as well. Having that sort of experience, I guess, from, as you said, from different perspectives is really, really important. And as I was saying, I'll go back to the point as well. Bringing up around Robbie Moore. Are you still in touch with Robbie Moore as well?
I
In
am,
Parliament?
I am. So prior to Parliament, I was aware that he'd been elected. He was a councillor previously as well. But I'd gone down to London. He'd gone up to the north of England, and we'd kind of not been in touch. But since we've both been in Parliament, we've met up a couple of times. There was a good picture we took of ourselves in our old school ties. That the school was very touched by, and actually we've been contacted by a couple of media organisations to kind of do a proper interview back at the school and just talk about how people from these sorts of backgrounds, and Robbie's kind of his family are farmers, and my parents are teachers, but but not from typically political backgrounds, not from the sort of places you would expect to see that clustering of MPs, I should say. But yeah, he's a great guy, and it's really funny in that he was re-elected as a Conservative this time round in the sort of seat where they lost a lot of MPs, and I very briefly chatted to him about it, and it comes down to real simple stuff like being very available for your residents, doing a lot of door knocking, talking to them, and understanding their issues, and solving people's issues when they come to you for help, and when you get casework through with somebody who does need help, and if you are very effective at helping people, then that does help you mitigate against some of the bigger kind of national political winds that will sweep a lot of other people away. So it does work quite well. It's a bit of a cliche to say that working hard and being a good person does tend to have its benefits.
As you were saying, I'm just looking at Robbie Moore's seat here of Kylie and Ickley. Like he only got a
Keithley and Ilkley.
Oh, Keithley and Ickley. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
As you said, he really got he won his seat pretty, wouldn't say comfortably, of course, but it was against the national swing and those sort of seats.
It was, yeah.
In the northeast of England. So it is quite impressive to try and hold that sort of seat. And I think in a lot of those seats, even in North England, Reform did quite well, and Reform only got like 10% of that seat. So he did a very, very good job. So yeah, hopefully, maybe you guys could maybe do a podcast. I should have actually gotten you and Robbie on the podcast together. That would have been great. That would have been a great idea.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll come back for one. Maybe if you could approach him and ask him for a chat, because I think there'd be a lot of common ground from our kind of childhoods and upbringing, and then obviously it diverged quite a lot on kind of the political direction or the political philosophy as a Conservative, slightly different to my approach. But then actually you kind of converge back with a common thread. So yeah, maybe that's a follow up.
Yeah, and I was just going to ask as well. Finally, on this question, did you and Robbie at that time, were you guys very political at that sort of age? Did you kind of realize it was
no? You see, that's the funny thing. That's the funny thing. I think you will probably find much more. Well, okay, maybe I'm making a statement there I can't back up with evidence. So I was not political at all, other than my dad being a counsellor and helping him with leafleting. Throughout my entire school and university, I was not political at all. But when I graduated, I joined the Liberal Democrats, and again, that was more due to being familiar with the policies and just having brought up around those.
Your dad was
values.
A Liberal Democrat councillor.
Yes, he was. Yeah, and so that was what I was used to. That was what I was familiar with, and that then just that was where I went. This is just before the 2010 election, and I think that you associated with the values. So liberalism, Liberal Democrats are all about small government and leaving people to do what they like with minimal government interference, but with then appropriate regulation and legislation to protect society. So we kind of quite often refer back to the harm principle, which is where you look at your actions and how they impact others. And at some point on that spectrum, you will choose that this is an appropriate point to legislate, and therefore you will, take action against that activity. And there's a debate at the moment about smoking and banning smoking or smoking indoors and outdoors. And that's a really good example of where I would apply the harm principle to those activities. So, you have the right to smoke, you have the right to take actions as you see fit yourself, but at some point those actions have impacts on others. So that harm principle then goes from, well, are you impacting yourself only? In which case, look, we'll try and encourage you to make healthy choices, but in terms of legislation, you're allowed to do that. But then indoors, that smoking is going to affect others. So the harm is upon others. So it's appropriate to legislate and to restrict those actions because your actions have an impact on others. And therefore, somewhere along those lines, you say, okay, fine, yes, we're going to ban indoor smoking. At the moment, there's a suggestion that the government may well ban smoking outdoors in particular locations. And so it's a really good example of where, on a similar spectrum of the harm principle, the point shifts. So it's much further down the authoritarian end of the spectrum because you're impacting people who want to smoke outdoors. The impact on people around them is minimal. And so that is that kind of shows the difference between the Labour government, who are much happier at banning things, much happier at taking an authoritarian view on people's freedoms. Whereas for us as Liberals, we tend to kind of be really careful about how you're impacting on people's actions. So another easy example of the harm spectrum is something like speed limits. So when you're driving on the highway, you have your right to drive your car broadly wherever you like, but you also have a responsibility to society to do that safely. So speed limits are an appropriate measure to reduce the danger to others that you may well represent if you want to drive at 100 miles an hour along a residential street. So that's obviously not appropriate. But for me, the way to look at that is on that harm principle. Your actions are imparting danger on others. So it is appropriate for the government to say, no, you can't do that. Now, whether you then have an argument about whether 20 miles per hour or 30 miles per hour is appropriate is a discussion that you can talk about and then bring evidence to it. So what is survivability? What's the likelihood of impacts? What's the type of road? What's the lighting? Things like that. And that is where to have the debate. But from a harm principle perspective, it's an easy way to think about how that would impact people. So yeah, that's where I came to. Liberalism, is pretty straightforward. It's progressive. It's positive. It's internationalist. It's pro-European. It's about kind of knocking down barriers between people. Whereas for me, when I compare that to other political directions, that is quite different. And I think that we all back ourselves to win an argument on our policies and on our values. And so I think everybody you'd have on the podcast thinks that in a fair fight or in a fair discussion, their values would be the most attractive, be the most positive, and be the right way to go. So I'm probably no different to anybody you've had on the podcast in that sense.
Australian politicians on the podcast, I'll tell you that. I think we've had I don't know if you know about the political party here called One Nation.
Yes.
Oh, you've heard about them? Oh, okay. Yeah, we've had some of them on before, and then we've had some Greens MPs. So It's been a quite wide spectrum.
Yeah.
Of course, Liberals as well, which I actually now listen to how you refer to liberalism. It kind of does cross over a little bit with the Liberal Party in Australia, but I'm guessing the Liberal Party in Australia is a bit more conservative and that sort of thing. But there is a little bit of a crossover, I think, with there are some people within the party who do have those sort of liberalistic sort of ideologies and feelings towards things. And then, of course, we have Labour, which really is technically almost the exact same as the Labour Party in the UK, trade union based, pretty authoritarian, very centralized, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so the Liberal Democrats are formed of the old Liberal Party, which I imagine is much more similar to your Liberals, and an offshoot of the Labour Party in the late 70s, who were much less authoritarian, much more kind of socially liberal, and they split off to form a smaller party the kind of the rump of the Liberal Party that still existed at that point. They formed an alliance for many years, and then they merged formally to become the Liberal Democrats. So you have both quite a kind of very progressive, socially liberal policies. So, very much, pro minority rights, looking for, the progressive angles on particular issues, and also the, unencumbered by that conservative kind of restriction on progress. But you also then have almost kind of very slightly economically conservative approaches towards valuing free markets, and trusting that, or not having that objection to capitalism that the Labour Party might. We don't think that the state running things and managing the economy and nationalising things is the right way to go. But what you do need is appropriate regulation of markets and of industries, so that the consumer is protected, because that's ultimately what we want to be doing, is empowering the citizen to make choices about their society and giving them the opportunities to contribute. Liberals, or the Liberal Democrats, are very much a kind of a grassroots party. We want to devolve power to communities to make decisions as they see fit. So we want to encourage better funding for local government, for councils, so that they're able to make decisions at that level that their community can contribute to. So as a councillor as well, which I still am, I'm able to award funding to local groups. I'm able to stand up in the council chamber in my borough, and argue for changes to speed limits, or to building more homes in particular areas, and environmental policy in councils, and giving local government more decision-making powers and more funding as well. I think that's something the Liberal Democrats push massively different to Labour and the Conservatives, who would naturally push for more centralisation of power. So they see national government and national politicians as the best place to make these decisions for all the country. So again, I don't know how that kind of aligns to your familiar political parties, to kind of whether localization and kind of delegation of powers is the right way to do it, rather than centralization, which we would fight as Liberals at every opportunity.
I think we're a bit different there, because we have state jurisdiction. So we have equivalent, of course, to counties. Like every state has its own premier. It's very similar to like the US in terms of like governors, and Canada in terms of like premiers as well. So I guess that's sort of states have their own issues they focus on, and the federal government has their issues that they focus on. So it's not as centralized all around one government form. So I'd probably say the parties here aren't probably as centralized as they would be in the UK. And I'm going to move on now to our next question for you, Luke. So prior to the 2024 UK election, you work as a project manager and an analyst for a consultancy. Are you able to briefly talk about this work experience and how it prepared you for your run in Parliament?
Yeah, so I spent 15 years after I graduated, 16 now, working as a transport planning consultant. So first of all, I worked for Arup, who are a big engineering consultant. They've got big offices in Australia. And my role was an airport planning consultant. And I did spend a couple of weeks in Melbourne working on a project at the airport there. I spent 4 months living in Auckland in New Zealand, working on the airport there, on the new international terminal, and runway works and all this sort of stuff. And Singapore, I spent 2.5 years living in Toronto. I spent a year in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, Doha. Yeah. So in aviation, typically projects are big airports around the world. So I spent a lot of time learning how to manage big, diverse groups of people. So that's not only the client, but also stakeholder teams, analysis, and working on the projects around the world. And I think in how that prepares me for being a politician, I think working with big groups of people is like being a successful political campaigner, because you've got lots of people coming into a political campaign with diverse sets of skills, lots of different experience, and you've got to quite quickly motivate them, work out what our goals are, and then form them into teams to go out and knock on doors, or put together literature, or do media and things like that. So that was something I was very, very comfortable with. But also the technical basis. So a lot of my politics is about evidence-based policy. And I think that's a Liberal Democrat thing as well. It's working out the best way to get the best outcomes for your residents. So if you've got options around economic policies or transport policies, or the best way to incentivize people to, like we spoke about earlier, give up smoking. Like, let's work out, let's use studies, let's use evidence to build a policy and to build a platform that achieves our goals most successfully. Don't get caught up in your ideology. Don't, just because you feel, yeah, exactly. Just because you feel something really hard as a politician doesn't mean it's going to work. Doesn't mean it's going to happen. What you need to do is use evidence and science a bit to come up with good policies. And that, as an engineer, as an analyst who had to do that for a job, going through all sorts of level of understanding of clients' needs, of demand forecasts, of stakeholder requirements, and fitting that together into an outcome. I think that's something that I want to bring into Parliament, and I think we would benefit from more politicians with that background, rather than kind of these robots who just feel things really hard and they want something to happen a lot, but it's not actually related to reality. And it ends up having bad policy and bad outcomes, and then they turn around and says, "Oh, who could have possibly guessed that this ridiculous Brexit wouldn't have worked?" When any reasonable, sensible human being who looked at it with evidence and reason could have said, "Well, of course that was going to happen." So yeah, that's a bit about, and it is another reason why I wanted to get into politics, because I looked at the politicians that we had and thought, well, actually, I could do a better job than that.
And as you said, at the end of the day, if you let your emotions take over yourself, you're not going to think logically, you're not going to make informed and good decisions. So backing science and backing what research tells you, I think, is the most important way to make informed decisions. So I'll move on to our next.
Well, no, I was going to say, I relate that then to my time as a councillor. So all of that real kind of very kind of logical and sensible and evidence-based policy then does actually clash with when you're dealing with people and dealing with residents who are scared. They are confused, they're worried, they're being threatened with eviction, they don't have enough money to pay the bills this week, their kids are struggling at school, they can't find a school place that's appropriate. And no matter how much you've got logical, sensible, reasonable answers to their problems, you have to then remember that you're dealing with people. And so my 2 years I've been a councillor, but also as a campaigner a bit longer before that, you do have to be really conscious that dealing with people is critical, and that the communication of policies and just generally helping people and being responsive to them and reassuring them that you're going to do what you can to help, that's as important, if not more important, than the hard kind of successful, effective policy perspective. So I think that's one of the big things that I've learned as a councillor, is not about kind of legislation, it's not about delivery policy, it's been about people, and it's been about Liberal Democrats, I think, typically are very, very grassroots politicians. We knock on the doors a lot, we speak to residents, we ask them what their problems are, we ask them how we can help, and you try and solve their problems on the doorstep. So as well as doing the big kind of nice big evidence-based policy stuff, you're also kind of as a councillor, you are a caseworker. You're solving people's problems. So that is something that I've learned as a councillor, and I think, again, as well as the big kind of nice banner that says evidence-based policy, it's also the kind of really helping people one-to-one and solving their problems.
And talking about your councillor career, what were some of the main differences since you've entered Parliament that you found being a councillor and being an MP? As you previously said, you still are in both roles. So what are some of the main differences and similarities, of course, that you find in both of those roles?
Yeah, so one of the good examples is around funding for children with special educational needs. That's a real crisis at the moment in the UK. Budgets are restricted on finding staff for children who need additional support. They need additional teaching assistants, they might need one-to-one lessons, they might need to be taught in a special setting. The funding just isn't there. So as a councillor, I'm dealing with parents who are struggling with this. We also run our council, so we are delivering the policies as well. So it's not just like we're having to lobby the council itself. So we, as Liberal Democrats in Sutton, are running the council. We're taking those decisions. We're making really tough decisions on stuff that we can fund and stuff we can't fund. So as a councillor, it was kind of troubleshooting and it was caseworking, trying to work the system to get that right. But now, as the MP, it's my responsibility to get more funding. It's my responsibility to try and change the system to make it more fairer in terms of funding, and also that the system is set up to encourage more people into those jobs. So you have more teachers, you have more speech therapists, you have more occupational therapists. So that's something that's the switch, I think, between the councillor's role is, like I say, troubleshooting and caseworking, and a lot of the time saying, this isn't something I can help you with. This is something the government needs to change. Now it's my job to be a much more effective advocate for those big changes that fix the problem in the first place.
And I think that's the most important thing as well, because as you said, being in the UK Parliament, in the House of Commons, you do get more power and you get more say on certain things. So actually, being in that sort of situation really can help you help the community that you represent more than actually being a councillor.
Yeah.
Which I guess, in a sense, is more localized and more focused on certain areas rather than a big sprawling electorate or constituency. But,
yeah, it is. But although, I mean, the only thing I'd say counter to that is that where we run the council, I mean, so we run our council, and we've run our council for 38 years. The Liberal Democrats have a strong history and a long history in Sutton Borough, so it's southwest London. And residents have trusted us to look out for their best interests and to do our best to deal with the funding situation that we are put in by the national government. So I sit on the planning committee, so I deal with planning applications from across the borough. I sit on the Environment and Sustainable Transport Committee, so we decide things like speed limits, road resurfacing, our environmental policies, so how we encourage recycling, dealing with street cleaning and park management and things like that. That's what I'm responsible for doing, and that's across the borough. So I can actually get that done across ironically, a bigger area than I represent in Parliament, because it's across 2 parliamentary seats. But again, it is subject to the constraints of you're given a certain amount of money from government, you're given a certain amount of powers. It's now my responsibility to try and get that improved, get that deal done better, or increase the powers that we have.
Very interesting there, quite, and and that's probably going to be your job for the next 4 or 5 years now, as a UK parliamentarian. And hopefully you do a great job with that, Luke, and hopefully you represent the community of Sutton and beyond very, very well.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really looking forward to it. It's an incredible opportunity, and hopefully, and I mean, I'm sure every politician says this, hopefully they can leave when they do, or in 5 years' time, when this Parliament, or that when we come to the next election, that I can say, look, I've achieved this, I've achieved these outcomes, and we are in a better position than we were when I got here. And I've cleared up some of the mess that we were in. I've got residents who are better off now than when I was elected.
And I'll move on now to our next question then for you, Luke. So this is a bit of off topic sort of question, but what's one of the biggest shocks you've experienced being elected to Parliament? And for example, like, what's something you've experienced that you didn't realize actually happened in Parliament?
Yeah, well, so I'll be honest, one of the biggest shocks for me was when you are elected, you are suddenly a small business owner. So I don't know whether it's structured differently in Australia, but you as the MP now have a budget to run your constituency office, run your team, but that's down to you. I have to go out and recruit the staff and write their employment contracts and find an office to be based in the constituency. None of that's provided. The money's there, but I have to suddenly learn all these skills. And my background isn't business; it's being a consultant, and it's working in large organisations. But now I have to learn all those skills, and some support is given. But it is, there are 650 MPs who operate as 6, 7, 8 person small businesses. And that was the biggest shock of how fundamental that challenge was. You think you get elected and then you go along to the Houses of Parliament and you vote on things and you do interviews and stuff, but that is a very small percentage of the role. It is this real kind of big responsibility to run an office. And now, obviously, as you get staff on board, they help with that, and you do get assistance from our party and also Parliament itself. But that was the biggest shock of actually, how things are structured and how you have to run things.
Yeah. And interestingly, that's quite similar to Australia, in the sense that MPs really run their offices. It is like a small business, but contrary to that, we actually don't get to pick where our offices are. So in the electorate,
Okay.
the government already decides like which office is already designated for an MP, and we have with our upper house. So we have a Senate, which is not like the House of Lords.
Yeah.
They get designated spots. So for example, in the state of Victoria, where I'm in, the upper house, they have designated like areas that represents this: the Western Metropolitan Region, which represents the west of Melbourne, the Northern Metropolitan Region, which is like the north of Melbourne, northeast is northeast, southeast, and then there's more rural and regional areas. So
Yeah.
in those areas, then you might have like 5 MPs representing that whole area, including the
Yeah.
lower house MPs, like equivalent to the House of Commons.
Yeah.
But those MPs in the upper house, they can have an office in any part of the electorate, and they
Okay.
don't know until like the the government actually decides like where they're going to go and that sort of thing, and like
Hey, look, that's a
Parliament
much
decides.
better process. That's a much
Yes.
better process. You've got experts, or as I say experts, you've got people who are much more experienced in choosing appropriate places. Whereas here, we're just sent out to go out and compete with the local accountants or the local builder's merchant or an estate
Oh,
agent
really?
for an office. Yeah. And so right at the moment, we found a nice little place in Cheam town centre. It used to be, or currently used for currently being used as an accountant's office. We've got to get it redecorated. We've got to get the electrics sorted out. We've got to get some partitions put up. We've got to get all kind of
So you
everything set
currently,
up
so
within there.
Luke, you currently don't have an office right now to work from.
No, I'm at home. I've got it blurred so you can't see all my children's Lego behind me. Some MPs will be lucky that they'll have had a predecessor who had an office that they're just going to walk into. We won our seat from the Conservatives, so they're still running their office whilst they're winding down their operations, but we need ours as soon as possible for our staff to go and sit in. So at the moment we're all working from home. We get given an office in Parliament for our 2 or 3 people that we have there, so that's quite restricted. It's in the old, one of these old big old buildings. But in our constituency, it's entirely up to us. I think that there's definite reform I think needed there. That you have a permanent base that's owned by the government that the MP sits in, and that space is safe. It's kept up to date by the state, and you have some continuity. I think that is a better way to do it rather than have the massive amount of additional costs there are.
Exactly.
It does seem a bit daft, but I think again, this is probably where, as a liberal, I would kind of, as a pragmatist, I see that's the right way to do it. As a liberal, you'd probably say, well, actually, you need to give MPs the ability to choose what they see is best for their residents. So I think I can see both sides of that coin.
And interestingly, actually, in some of the offices I know in the Western Metropolitan Region, to where I'm based, which is where my MP is based, that I work for, the MP I actually work for, our office used to be a Labour office, and now we're in a Liberal office. So it can change like that. And as you said, with the Conservatives, there's not a seamless transition from one MP to another in an office. So it is quite interesting there. But I do recognize now it is nearly 8 p.m. here and probably 11 a.m. in.
Well, I guess you need to go out and meet your friends and have some drinks on a Friday night.
I had that last night, Luke. I had that last night.
Okay.
So that's why that's why I didn't want to do the interview on Thursday. I wanted to save that for Thursday, so Friday night we could spend it with you. But yeah, thank you very much.
Well,
Luke,
maybe there's a bit of insight. So my day now, I've got to go and drop off a load of leaflets, thank you leaflets that we're delivering after my election. So I've got to go and drop those off with some of my deliverers and distributors. And then I'm going to grab a quick bite to lunch. And then this afternoon, I'm out knocking on doors in a council by-election that we've got in another seat. So I'm going to spend 5 or 6 hours doing that this afternoon, knocking on doors, talking to residents, trying to persuade them to vote for us. And then I'm going to collapse onto the sofa at about 7 or 8 o'clock tonight and try and have a little cool off before a weekend of community events, meeting residents, and that sort of stuff. So that's my calendar now.
Yes, very, very busy calendar, but as you expect from an MP. So I do really appreciate you sparing an hour of your day, Luke, to come on the podcast and speak to us. And hopefully we can maybe
No
organize an
worries.
interview with Robbie Moore in the future, with both
Yeah,
of you talking specifically about maybe your high school life together and
yeah,
some things that,
yeah.
you'd like to talk about, and probably those different perspectives of joining the
Well, maybe
Conservatives and the
once
Lib
I've
Dems.
settled in, I can come up with all the things that I think are ridiculous, and he can say, "Yeah, I've been doing that for 5 years." Think of
Exactly.
me.